Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing true Appalachian Trails horror stories that will make you reconsider ever stepping foot on America's most isolated and unforgiving mountain paths. These are not campfire tales or urban legends, but genuine accounts from hikers who experience the unexplainable in places where help is hours away, and darkness brings terrors that defy rational explanation. From mysterious disappearances to encounters with individuals who should not exist in those remote locations, each story has been compiled from first-hand witness reports and documented incidents that continue to baffle investigators. The Appalachian wilderness conceals realities that most people refuse to acknowledge, and perhaps ignorance truly is bliss. If you are drawn to authentic horror content rooted in real experiences that will leave you questioning what exists beyond the tree line, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into documented encounters with the unknown. After you hear these harrowing testimonies, we want you to share your own unexplained experiences in the comments below, because your story might be the next one we investigate. Now settle in as we journey into the heart of darkness that waits along the trail. Hartwell had always found peace in solitude, particularly the kind that could only be discovered deep within the wilderness. At 28 years old, she had spent the better part of her adult life exploring the Appalachian Trail, section by section, documenting her journeys in worn leather journals that lined the shelves of her Richmond apartment. She was not reckless or naive about the dangers that existed in remote places. She carried proper equipment, filed detailed itineraries with her younger sister Melissa, and maintained a healthy respect for the unpredictability of mountain weather. Her friends described her as methodical and cautious, someone who calculated risks before taking them. These qualities made what eventually happened to Aurora all the more disturbing and inexplicable. In late October, Aurora planned a solo 5-day trek through one of the more isolated sections of the trail that wound through southwestern Virginia. The stretch she chose saw relatively few hikers during autumn months, especially on weekdays, which suited her preference for quiet contemplation perfectly. She had researched the route extensively, marking water sources and shelter locations on her topographic maps. The weather forecast predicted clear skies and mild temperatures, ideal conditions for a late-season hike. On October 23rd, she kissed her sister goodbye, promised to text from the trailhead, and drove her aging Subaru to the parking area where her journey would begin. Melissa received that text at 9:17 in the morning. It would be the last communication anyone would receive from Aurora. The first 2 days of Aurora's hike proceeded without incident, at least according to the evidence that would later be pieced together by investigators. She signed the logbook at 2 different shelters, her handwriting neat and unhurried. Other hikers who passed through those same shelters in the days that followed would remember reading her entries, which described beautiful fall foliage and unseasonably warm afternoons. A retired couple from Pennsylvania told authorities they had briefly encountered Aurora on the morning of her 3rd day. They described her as cheerful and energetic, stopping to admire a hawk circling overhead. She had mentioned planning to reach the next shelter by nightfall, a reasonable goal given the distance and terrain. The couple continued northbound while Aurora headed south, and they never saw her again. Aurora did reach that shelter on her 3rd night. Her signature appeared in the logbook, dated October 25th. The entry itself proved to be the first indication that something unusual had begun to unfold. Unlike her previous neat and descriptive notes, this entry was brief and somewhat disjointed. She wrote that she had been hearing strange whistling sounds throughout the afternoon, a series of high-pitched tones that seemed to follow her along the trail. She noted that the sounds did not match Any bird calls she recognized. And they appeared to move through the forest parallel to her path, always maintaining the same distance. She wrote that she had tried to convince herself it was simply wind passing through the trees, or perhaps a type of wildlife she was unfamiliar with. But the whistling had an almost musical quality to it, rising and falling in what seemed like deliberate patterns. Two other hikers who arrived at the shelter the following day would later confirm to investigators that they had also heard unusual whistling sounds in that same area. They described the experience as unsettling, but not necessarily threatening, more curious than frightening. One of them, an experienced woodsman from West Virginia, said the sounds reminded him of old stories his grandfather used to tell about the mountains, tales of things that lived in the deepest hollows and mimicked human sounds to lure travelers off established paths. He had dismissed such stories as folklore, but hearing those whistles himself had made him pick up his pace until he was well clear of that section of trail. Neither hiker had seen any evidence of other people in the area, and both noted that the density of the forest in that region made visibility beyond a few dozen yards nearly impossible. Aurora's final confirmed location was that shelter on the evening of October 25th. What happened after she woke on the morning of the 26th remains a complete mystery. When she failed to arrive at the trailhead on October 28th as planned, Melissa immediately contacted park authorities. Rangers who knew Aurora's reputation as a responsible hiker took the report seriously and initiated a search that same afternoon. They hiked to the shelter where she had last signed in and began working outward from that location, following the trail in both directions while also searching the surrounding forest for any sign of her presence. The search expanded rapidly over the following days. Volunteers joined rangers and professional search and rescue teams. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept the canopy, looking for any heat signature that might indicate a lost or injured hiker. Bloodhounds were brought in and given Aurora's scent from clothing Melissa provided. The dogs followed a trail leading south from the shelter, consistent with the direction Aurora should have been traveling. But 3 miles from the shelter, at a point where the trail passed through a particularly dense stand of old-growth forest, the dogs became agitated and confused, circling the same area repeatedly before losing the scent entirely. The handlers found this behavior unusual and concerning. In their experience, dogs lost a scent when it was washed away by water or when the subject entered a vehicle. Neither explanation seemed to apply in this situation. It was during this intensive search, 6 days after Aurora disappeared, that rescuers made their first disturbing discovery. A young volunteer spotted Aurora's backpack hanging from a tree branch, approximately 12 feet above the ground. The location was roughly a quarter mile off the established trail, in an area of forest so thick that sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor. The backpack had been carefully hung, not thrown or dropped, and showed no signs of damage or distress. Everything Aurora should have needed for survival remained inside. Her water filtration system, emergency supplies, food, first aid kit, and spare clothing were all accounted for. Her identification and cash were still in an interior pocket. Her cell phone, dead but undamaged, was found in a side pocket. Even more puzzling, her journal was still there, and the final entry matched what she had written in the shelter logbook about the whistling sounds. There was no indication of what might have prompted her to remove her backpack and hang it so carefully in such an unlikely location. The second discovery came 2 days later. A search team working a grid pattern found Aurora's hiking boots placed side by side on top of a flat boulder, approximately 50 yards from where her backpack had been found. The boots were positioned with almost ritualistic precision, laces tucked inside, pointing toward the north. The boulder itself sat in a small clearing surrounded by ancient hemlocks, a place that felt somehow separate from the forest around it. Several searchers later admitted they had felt uncomfortable in that clearing, though none could articulate exactly why. The boots showed normal wear consistent with 3 days of hiking, but no damage or bloodstains. Forensic examination would later reveal no useful evidence. The boulder's surface was too rough to hold footprints, and the surrounding forest floor was carpeted with decades of fallen needles that revealed nothing. These discoveries prompted an even more intensive search effort. If Aurora had removed her boots, conventional wisdom suggested she could not have gone far. People experiencing hypothermia sometimes remove their clothing in a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. But the weather had been mild, and Aurora had been properly equipped. Dehydration or injury might cause disorientation, but her supplies had been abandoned, not used up. Investigators considered every possibility. Could she have been meeting someone? Phone records showed no suspicious contacts. Could she have been fleeing from something? There were no signs of pursuit or struggle. Could she have suffered a psychological break? Melissa insisted her sister had been in excellent mental health, and Aurora's journal entries supported this claim. Every logical explanation seemed to dissolve under scrutiny. The search continued for 3 weeks, eventually involving over 200 volunteers, multiple agencies, and significant resources. Every cave, every ravine, every possible location within a 5-mile radius of her last confirmed position was examined and re-examined. Helicopters flew grids at varying altitudes. Drones equipped with cameras scoured areas too difficult for ground teams to access. Divers checked a creek that ran through the search area, though it seemed unlikely Aurora would have entered water after removing her boots. Despite all these efforts, not a single additional trace of her was found. No footprints, no torn clothing, no disturbed vegetation that might indicate passage. It was as though Aurora had simply ceased to exist at that location, leaving behind only her carefully placed belongings as evidence she had ever been there at all. Theories proliferated, each more troubling than the last. Some investigators privately wondered if Aurora had staged her own disappearance. But this theory collapsed under the weight of contradictory evidence. Her bank accounts remained untouched. She had no debts, no enemies, no reason to flee her life. Her relationships were stable and positive. Nothing suggested she wanted to vanish. Other investigators considered the possibility of foul play, but the logistics seemed impossible. How could someone abduct a physically fit, experienced hiker in dense forest without leaving any evidence of struggle or transportation? The location where her belongings were found could not be accessed by vehicle, and carrying an unconscious or resistant person through that terrain would have been extremely difficult and would surely have left signs of passage. Local residents offered their own explanations, many rooted in Appalachian folklore that stretched back generations. They spoke of gaps in the mountains where people stepped out of the normal world into something else, places where the boundary between our reality and another grew thin. They mentioned the whistling sounds, nodding knowingly as if Aurora's logbook entry confirmed suspicions they had harbored for years. Old-timers recalled other disappearances throughout the decades, hikers and hunters who had walked into the forest and never returned. Their fates never determined. Some of these stories were documented, others existed only in oral tradition, passed down through families who had lived in the shadow of the mountains for centuries. Investigators listened politely, but continued to search for rational explanations. As weeks turned into months, the search was eventually scaled back and then suspended. Aurora's case remained open, but active investigation ceased. Her family refused to give up hope. Melissa took a leave of absence from her job, and spent months hiking the trails herself, calling her sister's name until her voice grew hoarse, leaving notes at every shelter begging for information. She organized volunteer search parties on weekends, focusing on areas that official searches might have missed. She studied maps until she could navigate the region from memory, looking for some pattern or clue that might explain what had happened. She found nothing. The anniversary of Aurora's disappearance came and went. Then another. Melissa created a website dedicated to her sister's case, posting every detail she could gather, hoping someone might recognize something significant that had been overlooked. The site received thousands of visitors, but generated no useful leads. People shared stories of their own unexplained experiences in the Appalachian wilderness, creating a strange digital archive of encounters that defied explanation. But none brought authorities any closer to understanding what had happened to Aurora. 3 years after Aurora vanished, Melissa received a letter with no return address, postmarked from a small town in Tennessee. Inside was a single photograph, slightly out of focus, showing a section of forest that Melissa eventually identified as being within the search area where her sister had disappeared. In the background, barely visible among the trees, was a figure that might have been human. The photograph's quality made identification impossible, and forensic analysis proved inconclusive. It might have been Aurora. It might have been another hiker. It might have been a shadow or trick of light. The photograph raised more questions than it answered, and the sender never came forward to explain how they had taken it or why they had waited 3 years to share it. Investigators examined the image thoroughly, but could extract no actionable information from it. Aurora Hartwell remains missing. Her case file sits in a drawer somewhere, periodically reviewed when similar disappearances occur, but essentially cold. The section of trail where she vanished continues to attract hikers, most of whom know nothing about what happened there. Those who do know tend to move quickly through that area, camping at different shelters, avoiding the deep forest where her belongings were found. Some hikers report hearing unusual whistling sounds in that region, though they rarely mention it officially, wary of being dismissed or ridiculed. The forest keeps its secrets, and whatever happened to Aurora during those missing hours between her final logbook entry and the discovery of her abandoned belongings remains known only to the ancient mountains themselves. Her family continues to search for answers that may never come, trapped in an endless state of uncertainty that is perhaps worse than any definitive ending could be. Nicholas Brennan had always approached hiking with the same methodical precision he brought to his work as a high school mathematics teacher. At 32 years old, he planned every aspect of his outdoor adventures with careful attention to detail, creating spreadsheets that tracked mileage, elevation gain, water sources, and shelter locations. His colleagues often joked about his obsessive preparation, but Nicholas believed that proper planning separated successful adventures from preventable disasters. When he decided to spend his spring break hiking a 40-mile section of the Appalachian Trail through Pennsylvania, he spent weeks researching the route, studying weather patterns, and ensuring his equipment met every possible need. He filed a detailed itinerary with his partner Marcus, including GPS coordinates for each planned stopping point and specific times when he expected to reach cell service areas. Marcus, accustomed to Nicholas's thoroughness, kept the documents in a folder on their kitchen counter, not expecting he would need to reference them under circumstances neither of them could have anticipated. Nicholas began his hike on a Monday morning in mid-April, starting from a trailhead where Marcus dropped him off with a kiss and a reminder to stay safe. The first 2 days proceeded exactly as Nicholas had planned. The weather remained mild and clear. The trail conditions were excellent, with only occasional muddy patches from recent rain. Nicholas maintained his planned pace, arriving at each shelter with enough daylight remaining to set up his sleeping area, filter water, and prepare a hot meal. He encountered other hikers periodically, exchanging the usual pleasantries about trail conditions and weather forecasts. Most were section hikers like himself, though a few were through hikers attempting the entire trail from Georgia to Maine. Nicholas enjoyed these brief social interactions, but also appreciated the solitude that hiking provided. A stark contrast to his days spent in classrooms filled with restless teenagers. On his third evening, Nicholas arrived at a shelter located deep in state forest land, several miles from the nearest road. The structure was a typical three-sided lean-to with a wooden sleeping platform elevated above the ground to discourage rodents. A fire ring sat in front of the shelter, surrounded by logs arranged as seating. A bear box for food storage stood nearby, its metal surface scarred by years of abuse from animals testing its defenses. Nicholas arrived around 5 in the afternoon, pleased to have beaten the fading light. As he approached the shelter, he noticed a backpack already leaning against the interior wall, indicating someone had claimed space for the evening. This was not unusual or concerning. Trail etiquette dictated that shelters operated on a first-come, first-served basis, with space shared among whoever arrived. Nicholas had shared shelters with strangers numerous times without incident. The backpack's owner was nowhere immediately visible, but Nicholas assumed he was either gathering firewood or filtering water from the nearby spring. Nicholas chose a spot on the opposite end of the sleeping platform from the other pack and began his evening routine. He removed his boots, changed into camp shoes, and spread out his sleeping bag to air out. He was organizing his cooking supplies when he heard footsteps approaching through the forest. A man emerged from the trees carrying an armload of small branches. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with unkempt dark hair streaked with gray and a weathered face that suggested significant time spent outdoors. His clothes were worn and dirty beyond what a few days on the trail would explain. His boots were held together with duct tape, and his jacket bore multiple repairs made with mismatched thread. The man stopped when he saw Nicholas, making eye contact that lasted a moment too long before speaking. He introduced himself simply as Lee, offering no surname or additional information. His voice was rough, as though unused to conversation. Nicholas offered his own name and asked the usual questions about where Lee had started hiking and where he planned to finish. Lee's answers were vague and evasive. He claimed to be section hiking but could not provide specific details about his route. When Nicholas mentioned he was a teacher on spring break, Lee asked which school district, what town Nicholas lived in, whether he lived alone, and how long he planned to be on the trail. The questions felt invasive, crossing boundaries that existed even among strangers sharing temporary quarters. Nicholas provided general answers, growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. As darkness settled over the forest, Nicholas prepared his dinner while Lee built a fire in the ring. The flames cast flickering shadows across the shelter's interior, creating an atmosphere that felt more oppressive than welcoming. Nicholas ate his rehydrated meal quickly, hoping to finish his evening routine and retreat into his sleeping bag, creating a psychological barrier between himself and his sheltermate. Lee ate nothing, instead sitting on one of the logs near the fire, watching Nicholas with an intensity that made every movement feel scrutinized. Nicholas tried to make casual conversation about the trail, the weather, plans for the following day. Lee responded with single-word answers or silence, never breaking his steady gaze. Nicholas noticed other disturbing details as the evening progressed. Lee's backpack appeared nearly empty, sagging against the shelter wall in a way that suggested minimal contents. When Lee shifted position, Nicholas glimpsed inside the pack's open top and saw almost nothing. No sleeping bag, no food supplies, none of the equipment necessary for extended hiking. Yet Lee claimed to have been on the trail for over a week. Nicholas's mind raced through possible explanations. Perhaps Lee was hiking ultralight, carrying only essential items. Perhaps his gear was packed in a way that compressed it efficiently. Perhaps he was resupplying from caches he had hidden along the trail. None of these explanations felt satisfactory. But Nicholas tried to give Lee the benefit of doubt, reminding himself that people hiked in various ways and not everyone followed conventional approaches. Around 9 in the evening, Nicholas announced he was going to sleep, hoping this would establish boundaries for the night. He climbed onto the sleeping platform, removed his camp shoes, and slid into his sleeping bag, fully clothed. He positioned himself facing the shelter's open front, with his back to the wall, ensuring he could see the entire interior space and the fire beyond. Lee remained by the fire, still sitting in that same watchful position. Nicholas closed his eyes, but did not sleep. He heard every sound with heightened awareness. The crackling of the fire, the wind moving through trees, the distant call of an owl. He heard Lee finally move, footsteps approaching the shelter, boots scraping against the wooden platform as Lee climbed up. Nicholas maintained his breathing in a steady rhythm, feigning sleep while remaining acutely alert. He had positioned his pocket knife within easy reach before getting into his sleeping bag, and he could feel its reassuring weight near his hand. Lee moved around the shelter, and Nicholas heard him unrolling something that sounded like a sleeping pad. But the sounds were wrong somehow. Too deliberate, too controlled. Nicholas risked opening his eyes to narrow slits, just enough to see through his lashes without obviously appearing awake. What he saw made his heart begin to race. Lee was not preparing for sleep. He was standing at his backpack, removing something from an exterior pocket. The object caught moonlight filtering into the shelter, revealing a metallic sheen. For several minutes, that felt like hours, nothing happened. Nicholas kept his breathing steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Lee stood motionless, holding whatever he had retrieved from his pack. Nicholas could not identify the object clearly in the darkness, but its size and shape suggested something that could be used as a weapon. His mind cataloged possibilities: a knife, a hatchet, a length of pipe. The specifics mattered less than the obvious fact that Lee was not preparing for sleep, but instead appeared to be building courage or waiting for the right moment to act. Nicholas understood with absolute clarity that he was in immediate danger. Nicholas's training as a teacher included protocols for active threat situations. He knew that passivity in the face of clear danger often led to worse outcomes than direct confrontation. He made a decision in that moment that likely saved his life. He sat up abruptly, switched on his headlamp to its brightest setting, and spoke in a firm, loud voice. He said he was awake, that he could see what Lee was doing, and that Lee needed to explain himself immediately. The sudden light and direct confrontation clearly caught Lee off guard. He stepped backward, raising one hand to shield his eyes from the headlamp's beam. Nicholas saw the object in Lee's other hand clearly now. It was indeed a knife, a fixed-blade hunting knife with at least a 6-inch blade. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the shelter's interior, one holding a light and the other holding a blade. Nicholas did not break eye contact or show fear, though his heart hammered in his chest. He told Lee that he was leaving, that he was going to pack his belongings and hike out immediately, and that Lee should stay exactly where he was. Lee said nothing in response, but something in his posture changed. The predatory tension seemed to deflate slightly. Nicholas moved quickly and deliberately, never turning his back to Lee, keeping his headlamp focused in Lee's direction. He stuffed his sleeping bag into its sack without rolling it properly, crammed his belongings into his pack without organizing them. and shouldered the pack while keeping his own knife visible in his hand. As Nicholas backed toward the shelter's edge, Lee suddenly moved. He did not advance toward Nicholas, but instead grabbed his own nearly empty pack and fled into the darkness beyond the fire ring. He moved quickly despite the rough terrain, disappearing into the forest within seconds. Nicholas did not wait to see if Lee would return. He descended from the shelter platform, grabbed his water bottles from where they sat near the fire, and began hiking south on the trail by headlamp. He knew this was dangerous. Hiking at night carried significant risks of injury from falls or getting lost. But those risks seemed far preferable to remaining in that shelter with a man who had been standing over him with a knife in his hand. Nicholas hiked for 4 hours through the darkness, driven by fear and adrenaline. He did not stop moving until he reached a Forest Service road shortly after 2 in the morning. He followed the road east until he encountered a hunting camp where 2 men were beginning their morning preparations. They were understandably surprised to see a hiker emerge from the darkness, and even more surprised when Nicholas explained what had happened. They immediately offered him use of their phone, and Nicholas called Marcus, who began the 3-hour drive to pick him up. Nicholas also called the Pennsylvania State Police to report the incident. The men at the hunting camp stayed with him until both Marcus and the police arrived around dawn. The state police took Nicholas's statement seriously, particularly when they checked their databases and found that a man matching Lee's description was wanted for questioning in connection with an assault on another hiker 6 months earlier. That incident had occurred on a different section of the Appalachian Trail, roughly 80 miles north. A solo female hiker had been threatened at a shelter by a man who called himself Lee, though investigators suspected this was an alias. She had escaped without physical harm when other hikers arrived at the shelter, but the man had disappeared into the forest before anyone could detain him. Additional reports existed of a man matching the same description acting suspiciously around shelters and following solo hikers, particularly women, though none of these encounters had escalated to the level requiring police involvement. Despite these reports and Nicholas's detailed description, the man known as Lee was never apprehended. Investigators suspected he was living rough in the forest, moving between sections of trail and avoiding areas with heavy hiker traffic or law enforcement presence. Trail angels and hostel operators throughout Pennsylvania received bulletins with his description and warnings to report any sightings, but no confirmed encounters occurred. It was as though he had melted back into the wilderness, becoming part of the forest itself. This realization haunted Nicholas perhaps more than the immediate danger he had faced. The idea that this predator remained out there, stalking other hikers on isolated sections of trail, was deeply disturbing. Nicholas never returned to the Appalachian Trail. The experience shattered the sense of safety he had always felt in the wilderness. Marcus supported his decision completely, relieved that Nicholas had survived an encounter that easily could have ended differently. Nicholas still hikes occasionally, but only on heavily trafficked local trails during daylight hours, and only with companions. He completed the remaining portion of his spring break at home, unable to shake the memory of those hours in the shelter and the moment when he had opened his eyes to see Lee standing over him with that knife catching the moonlight. The case remains open in Pennsylvania State Police files, periodically cross-referenced when new incidents occur that might be related. Trail organizations increase their safety education efforts, emphasizing that while violent crime on the Appalachian Trail is statistically rare, it is not impossible. They encouraged hikers to trust their instincts when situations felt wrong, to report suspicious behavior immediately, and to understand that wilderness isolation, while appealing to many hikers, also created opportunities for those with predatory intentions. Nicholas sometimes wonders about other hikers who might have encountered Lee, particularly those who might not have woken up or might not have confronted the danger as directly as he did. He hopes his report and description have helped other hikers avoid similar situations, though the lack of an arrest provides no closure. Somewhere in the Appalachian wilderness, a predator may still be walking the same trails that thousands of hikers traverse each year, searching for victims in the isolated shelters where people seek rest and imagine themselves safe among fellow outdoor enthusiasts. Ellie Morrison had been looking forward to this hiking trip for months. At 24 years old and freshly graduated with her master's degree in environmental science, she had convinced two of her closest friends from college to join her for a week-long section hike through Virginia. The three young women had met during their undergraduate years and maintained their friendship through graduate school despite attending different universities. This hike represented a celebration of their academic achievements and a chance to reconnect before they scattered to different corners of the country for their respective careers. Ellie had researched the route extensively, choosing a popular section of the Appalachian Trail known for its scenic vistas and well-maintained shelters. Her friends, Jade and Morgan, were less experienced hikers, but trusted Ellie's judgment and preparation completely. They began their journey on a warm morning in early June, when the weather was generally favorable, and the trail saw consistent traffic from both section hikers and northbound through hikers working their way toward Maine. The first 3 days exceeded their expectations. The weather remained perfect, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures. They encountered friendly hikers who shared trail advice and recommendations for the best viewpoints. They swam in mountain streams, watched sunsets from rocky overlooks, and fell asleep each night exhausted but content. The physical challenges of hiking with full packs proved more demanding than Jade and Morgan had anticipated. But they adapted quickly, finding their rhythm and building confidence with each passing mile. On their fourth evening, they arrived at a shelter that Ellie's guidebook described as one of the most picturesque along this section of trail. The structure sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering oak trees, with a reliable spring located a short distance down a marked side trail. According to the guidebook, this shelter typically filled to capacity during peak season, sometimes requiring latecomers to pitch tents in the surrounding area. Ellie had planned their mileage carefully to ensure they arrived with enough daylight to secure space inside the shelter itself, preferring the psychological comfort of walls and a roof to the vulnerability of a tent. They reached the shelter around 6 in the evening, surprised to find it completely empty. No other packs leaned against the walls. No one occupied the sleeping platform. The fire ring showed no signs of recent use. This struck Ellie as unusual given the time of year and the shelter's reputation as a popular stopping point. But she reasoned that trail traffic could be unpredictable. Perhaps most hikers had pushed ahead to the next shelter, or perhaps many were taking a different route. The three friends claimed their sleeping spots, spreading their gear across the platform with the luxury of abundant space. They filtered water from the spring, prepared their dinners, and settled in to watch the sun disappear behind the mountains. As darkness descended, the atmosphere in the clearing began to feel subtly different. The cheerful camaraderie that had characterized their evening routine faded into a quieter, more watchful mood. None of the women could identify exactly what had changed, but they all felt it. The forest seemed too quiet, lacking the usual chorus of insects and nocturnal animals. The air felt heavy and still despite a breeze moving through the treetops. Morgan mentioned feeling uncomfortable, as though they were being observed, but saw nothing when she scanned the surrounding woods with her headlamp. Jade laughed nervously and suggested they were simply tired and letting their imaginations run wild in the unfamiliar darkness. Around 9 o'clock, as they were preparing for sleep, they heard footsteps. The sound came from somewhere beyond the shelter, moving through the forest with a slow, deliberate pace. Ellie called out, assuming another hiker was approaching the shelter and wanting to announce their presence in a friendly manner. She received no response. The footsteps continued, maintaining the same unhurried rhythm. The three women looked at each other with growing concern. Ellie called out again, louder this time, identifying herself and her friends and asking if anyone was there. Again, silence except for the footsteps, which seemed to be circling the shelter rather than approaching it directly. Morgan suggested it might be an animal, perhaps a deer or bear passing through the area. But the pattern of sound did not match animal movement. The footsteps were too regular, too evenly spaced, too clearly bipedal. They sounded like boots on forest floor, scattering leaves and occasionally snapping small branches. The three women moved closer together on the sleeping platform, shining their headlamps toward the source of the sound. The beams revealed only trees and darkness. Whatever was making the footsteps remained beyond the reach of their lights, maintaining a consistent distance from the shelter. For nearly an hour, the footsteps continued their circuit around the shelter. They never grew closer. They never receded into the distance. They never deviated from that same measured pace. The psychological effect was profound. Ellie considered their options. They could abandon the shelter and hike out by headlamp, but this seemed potentially more dangerous than remaining where they were. They could make noise, try to scare away whatever was circling them. But the complete lack of response to their earlier calls suggested this would be ineffective. They could wait it out, hoping whatever was out there would eventually lose interest and leave. They chose the final option, huddling together on the sleeping platform with their knives and trekking poles within easy reach. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The sudden silence felt almost worse than the sound had been. The three women sat in the darkness, straining to hear any indication of where the source of the footsteps had gone. Minutes passed with no sound except their own breathing and the wind in the trees above. Jade whispered that perhaps it had finally left. Ellie was about to agree when Morgan grabbed her arm tightly, pointing toward the shelter entrance. All three women turned to look, and their headlamps illuminated a figure standing motionless in the opening. The figure appeared human in general shape, standing upright and roughly 6 feet tall. But the details were wrong or absent. The headlamps seemed unable to properly illuminate it, as though the light was being absorbed rather than reflected. They could make out a silhouette, but no features, no clothing details, nothing that would identify this as a specific person. It simply stood there, blocking the entrance, utterly silent and completely still. None of the three women could move. They were frozen not by any physical restraint, but by a primal fear that locked their muscles and stole their voices. The figure remained in the entrance for what felt like an eternity, but was likely less than a minute. Then, without any transition or movement that they could perceive, it was no longer there. It had not turned away. It had not stepped back into the forest. It had simply ceased to be present. The three women did not sleep that night. They sat pressed against each other on the sleeping platform, keeping their headlamps on despite knowing the batteries would drain, desperately wanting the psychological comfort of light, even though it had done nothing to properly illuminate the figure. They took turns watching the entrance, though none of them truly believed sleep was possible for any of them. Every small sound from the forest made them jump. Every shadow cast by their lights seemed potentially threatening. They spoke very little, as though afraid their voices might attract the return of whatever had stood in that doorway. Dawn arrived with agonizing slowness. As soon as the first gray light of pre-dawn made the forest visible without headlamps, the three women packed their belongings with frantic speed. They did not eat breakfast. They did not filter fresh water. They simply wanted to leave that shelter and put as much distance as possible between themselves and whatever they had experienced during the night. They hiked rapidly despite their exhaustion, not stopping until they reached a road crossing where they could get cell service and call for someone to pick them up. They reported the incident to park rangers, describing everything they had witnessed as accurately as possible, while acknowledging how strange and unbelievable it sounded. The ranger who took their report listened without judgment and made notes in his incident log. He mentioned that this particular shelter had a history, though he seemed reluctant to provide details. When Ellie pressed him, he admitted that other hikers had reported unusual experiences at that location over the years. Unexplained footsteps were commonly mentioned. Several hikers had described seeing figures that did not behave like normal people. One thru hiker had abandoned his attempt to complete the trail after spending a night at that shelter, traumatized by something he refused to describe in detail. The ranger assured them that the area would be investigated, though he could not promise any explanation for what they had experienced. He suggested that isolation and darkness could play tricks on perception, that fatigue and stress could create powerful hallucinations, that natural phenomena were often misinterpreted as supernatural events. Ellie understood he was trying to provide rational explanations, but she knew what she had seen. So did Jade and Morgan. Whatever had circled that shelter and stood in its entrance had been real and present, not a trick of tired minds or overactive imaginations. None of the three women finished their planned week-long hike. They went home early, shaken by an experience that violated their understanding of what was possible. Ellie, whose career plans involved fieldwork in remote locations, found herself questioning whether she could handle the isolation she had once embraced. Morgan developed anxiety about being in dark or enclosed spaces. Jade began experiencing nightmares featuring shadow figures with absent features. The incident changed something fundamental in each of them, shattering a sense of safety they had not realized they possessed until it was gone. When investigators examined the shelter and surrounding area, they found nothing unusual. No footprints circled the structure. No evidence suggested anyone had been present in that location during the night in question. The shelter logs showed that the three women had indeed signed in as they claimed, and that no one else had signed in for that date. The next entry in the log was dated 2 days later and made no mention of anything unusual. The shelter remained in use, and most hikers who stayed there experienced nothing out of the ordinary. But periodically, reports would surface of strange footsteps, unexplained sounds, and shadow figures that appeared and vanished without explanation. Ellie eventually completed her degree and took a position with a conservation organization. But she declined assignments that required overnight stays in remote wilderness areas. She hikes occasionally on well-trafficked day trails, never venturing far from civilization or staying out after dark. She maintains contact with Jade and Morgan, and sometimes they discuss that night, trying to make sense of what they experienced. They have researched paranormal phenomena, read accounts of similar encounters, and explored every possible rational explanation. Nothing has provided satisfactory answers. The experience remains unexplained, a disturbing memory that reminds them the world contains mysteries that resist rational understanding and encounters that defy conventional explanation. Adam Castellano had always believed that his camera could reveal truths invisible to the naked eye. At 35 years old, he had built a modest reputation as a landscape photographer, specializing in remote wilderness areas where human presence remained minimal. His portfolio featured stunning images of forests, mountains, and hidden waterfalls, each photograph capturing moments of pristine natural beauty. when he decided to document lesser-known sections of the Appalachian Trail for a personal project about solitude in modern America. He approached the endeavor with his characteristic attention to detail and willingness to explore beyond established paths. This tendency to wander off trail in search of unique perspectives would lead him to a discovery that fundamentally altered his relationship with wilderness photography and left him questioning what other secrets remained hidden in the forests he thought he understood. Adam began his photographic expedition in mid-September, choosing this timing deliberately to capture the early stages of autumn foliage. He planned to spend 3 weeks hiking and photographing a remote section of trail in North Carolina, staying at shelters when convenient, but often camping in isolated locations that offered better photographic opportunities. His pack was heavy with camera equipment, lenses, filters, and the battery packs necessary to keep his gear charged during extended periods away from civilization. He had hiked and photographed in wilderness areas for over a decade, and the weight and logistics of carrying professional equipment on multi-day trips no longer intimidated him. The first week proceeded productively. Adam captured dozens of images he felt confident would strengthen his portfolio. The weather cooperated, providing dramatic cloud formations and the kind of diffused light that made forest photography particularly rewarding. He encountered few other hikers, which suited his purpose perfectly. His project centered on themes of isolation and the human relationship with untouched wilderness, and the absence of other people in his frames reinforced these concepts. He moved slowly through the landscape, sometimes hiking only a few miles in a full day, when he found locations that demanded extensive photographic attention. On his 8th day, Adam was following the main trail when he noticed an overlook marked on his topographic map. The map indicated the viewpoint sat approximately a quarter-mile off the established trail, accessed by what appeared to be a used trail created by previous hikers seeking the same vista. Adam decided to make the short detour, calculating that the elevated perspective might provide unique compositional opportunities. He marked his departure point carefully with his GPS device, ensuring he could navigate back to the main trail without difficulty. The used trail was faint but followable, marked occasionally by cairns that previous visitors had constructed to guide others to the overlook. The viewpoint exceeded his expectations. From a rocky promontory, he could see multiple ridgelines receding into the distance, each layer rendered in progressively lighter shades of blue by atmospheric perspective. He spent nearly an hour at this location, experimenting with different lenses and compositions, waiting for optimal light conditions. As he worked, he noticed what appeared to be another faint trail leading from the overlook deeper into the forest. This path showed no indication on his map and bore no official trail markers, but it was clearly more substantial than a game trail. The worn earth and occasional boot prints suggested human traffic, though not recent. Professional curiosity overcame caution. Adam decided to follow this unmarked path for a short distance, reasoning that it might lead to another photographic location that few people knew about. He walked carefully, continuing to track his position with his GPS and making note of distinctive landmarks that would aid his return. The trail wound through dense forest for approximately a quarter mile before opening into a small clearing that appeared deliberately created rather than naturally occurring. In the center of this clearing stood a structure that immediately commanded his full attention. The cabin was small, perhaps 12 feet square, constructed from weathered logs that suggested considerable age. However, the structure showed no signs of abandonment or decay that would indicate historical origins. The roof appeared intact. The door hung straight in its frame. The single visible window held unbroken glass. Adam approached cautiously, his photographer's eye noting details that seemed inconsistent with the cabin's apparent age and location. No road or vehicle track accessed this clearing. The nearest Forest Service road sat several miles away, across extremely difficult terrain. Yet someone had built this structure in a location that should have been essentially inaccessible to the materials and tools necessary for construction. The door stood slightly ajar, moving barely perceptibly in a breeze that Adam could not feel. He called out, announcing his presence and asking if anyone was home. He received no response. After a moment of hesitation, he pushed the door open wider and looked inside. What he saw in the cabin's dim interior made him instinctively step backward, his mind struggling to process the scene before him. The cabin's single room appeared to be occupied, though no person was present. A sleeping bag lay on a simple wooden platform that served as a bed. Canned food lined a rough shelf constructed from boards and rocks. A camping stove sat on a makeshift table. But it was the walls that captured and held Adam's horrified attention. Photographs covered nearly every available surface. Dozens of images, perhaps more than 100, had been pinned or taped to the log walls in overlapping layers. Adam moved closer, pulling out his own camera and beginning to document what he was seeing, his photographer's instincts overriding his growing unease. Every photograph showed hikers on the Appalachian Trail. Some were close-up shots taken with telephoto lenses, capturing individuals in startling detail. Others showed people at shelters, filtering water, eating meals, sleeping in their tents. None of the subjects appeared aware they were being photographed. Every image had the quality of surveillance rather than portraiture. Adam recognized some of the locations depicted in the photographs. Several showed the shelter where he had stayed 3 nights earlier. Others captured sections of trail he had walked during the previous week. His hands trembled slightly as he photographed the wall display, his mind racing through implications. Someone had been systematically photographing hikers in this area, collecting these images like trophies or specimens. The sheer number of photographs suggested this had been ongoing for an extended period. The range of seasons depicted in the images indicated activity across multiple years. This was not casual photography or innocent documentation. This was obsessive surveillance, conducted by someone who clearly understood how to move through the forest undetected. As Adam continued documenting the interior, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze. Footsteps approached the cabin from outside, moving with the confident pace of someone familiar with the terrain. Adam had only seconds to make a decision. The cabin had no back door or alternate exit. The single window was too small to climb through quickly. He could not leave without encountering whoever was approaching. His eyes scanned the cabin's interior desperately, looking for concealment. Behind the sleeping platform, a space opened between the platform and the wall, where previous occupants had apparently stored gear. Adam squeezed himself into this gap, pulling his pack in after him and trying to control his breathing. The footsteps reached the cabin. Through a small gap between boards, Adam could see a man enter. He appeared to be in his 50s or 60s, wearing clothes that matched the forest's colors so effectively, they seemed almost like camouflage. He carried a camera with an expensive telephoto lens attached, the kind of equipment that could capture detailed images from considerable distances. The man moved around the small space with practiced efficiency, setting his camera on the table and beginning to sort through a memory card's contents on a small laptop that had been hidden from Adam's initial view. Adam remained motionless, barely breathing, watching through the gap as the man cycled through recently captured images. Several showed hikers Adam recognized from shelters he had visited during his trip. One image showed Adam himself, photographed from behind as he filtered water at a spring 2 days earlier. Seeing his own image among this disturbing collection sent a wave of nausea through Adam's body. He had been watched, documented, added to this person's obsessive archive without his knowledge or consent. The man worked for perhaps 15 minutes, which felt like hours to Adam pressed into his hiding space. He muttered occasionally to himself, fragments of sentences that suggested some kind of cataloging system or organizational logic that existed only in his mind. He printed several images on a small portable printer, adding them to the wall collection with careful precision. Finally, he gathered his camera, checked the cabin's supplies, and departed. Adam waited, listening to the footsteps fade into the forest. He continued waiting, fearing the man might return, fearing that emerging too quickly might result in confrontation. After what he estimated to be 30 minutes, Adam carefully extracted himself from his hiding place. His muscles had cramped from the uncomfortable position, and his legs protested as he stood. He moved to the cabin's doorway and looked out carefully, seeing no one. He needed to leave immediately, but he also needed evidence. Using his camera, he photographed the interior systematically, capturing the wall of surveillance images from multiple angles. He photographed the sleeping area, the supplies, anything that might help authorities identify the cabin's occupant. He took GPS coordinates and shot video as he walked around the cabin's exterior, documenting its exact location and construction. Then Adam left, moving as quickly as caution allowed, back toward the overlook and eventually to the main trail. He did not stop moving until he reached a road crossing where he could get cell service. He immediately called local authorities, reporting what he had found and transmitting the GPS coordinates. The sheriff's department took his report seriously, promising to investigate immediately. Adam provided them with copies of his photographs and video, creating a digital record of the cabin's contents before anyone could disturb or remove evidence. 2 deputies accompanied Adam back to the location the following day. They followed his GPS tracks and found the overlook exactly where he had indicated. They followed the unmarked trail to the clearing, but the cabin had been abandoned and cleaned. The walls were bare, stripped of the photographs. The supplies had been removed. The sleeping bag, camping stove, laptop, printer, and camera equipment were all gone. Only the structure itself remained, empty and revealing nothing about its recent occupant. The deputies documented the scene, but without the photographs Adam had captured the previous day. The empty cabin proved nothing except that someone had built a structure in a remote location. Investigators searched the surrounding area extensively. They found no additional evidence, no trail that might indicate which direction the occupant had fled, no hidden caches of supplies or equipment. It was as though the person had simply evaporated, taking all evidence with them. Adam's photographs remained the only proof that the cabin had contained anything disturbing. Authorities suspected they were dealing with someone who had been stalking hikers for months or possibly years. Someone with extensive wilderness skills who could move through the forest and observe people without being detected. But without a suspect or additional evidence, the investigation stalled. The incident received brief media attention. Several hikers came forward reporting that they had felt watched or followed during trips through that region, though none could provide concrete evidence. Trail organizations increased patrols in the area and posted warnings encouraging hikers to report suspicious activity immediately. But the person who had occupied that cabin was never identified or apprehended. Adam completed his photographic project, but the images felt tainted by his experience. He could no longer look at photographs of solitary hikers without wondering who might be watching from the tree line. He could no longer enjoy the isolation he had once sought, knowing that remoteness could make people vulnerable to those with predatory intentions. He continues to photograph wilderness areas, but never alone anymore, and never without informing multiple people of his exact location and expected return time. The cabin and its wall of stolen images haunt him still. A reminder that the wilderness conceals not only natural beauty, but also human darkness, and that the watchers sometimes walk among those who seek solitude in America's forests. Sadie Montgomery had always found comfort in hiking, particularly during the quieter seasons when trails saw fewer visitors and the natural world felt more accessible to those willing to brave less hospitable conditions. At 29 years old, she worked as a nurse in a busy emergency department in Charlotte, North Carolina. And the physical and emotional demands of her profession left her craving the therapeutic silence of wilderness. She planned her hiking trips carefully around her rotating work schedule, often choosing weekends in late autumn or early spring when most recreational hikers stayed home. She appreciated the solitude these off-season excursions provided, and she had developed a reputation among her hiking companions as someone who remained calm and capable, even when conditions became challenging. In early November, Sadie planned a solo weekend section hike through a portion of the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina that she had never previously explored. The forecast predicted cool temperatures and possible fog in the higher elevations, but nothing that concerned her given her experience and equipment. She began her hike on a Saturday morning, parking her car at a trailhead and arranging for a shuttle service to pick her up at a different location Sunday afternoon. This approach allowed her to cover approximately 25 miles of trail without needing to backtrack, maximizing her limited time off work. The first day proceeded normally. Sadie maintained a steady pace, enjoying the late autumn landscape with its bare trees and occasional patches of lingering foliage. She encountered no other hikers, which did not surprise her given the season and the relatively remote nature of this trail section. She reached her planned shelter in late afternoon, finding it empty as expected. She completed her evening routine efficiently, filtering water and preparing dinner before darkness fell. The temperature dropped significantly after sunset, and Sadie could see her breath in the beam of her headlamp as she organized her sleeping area. She fell asleep listening to wind moving through the bare branches above the shelter, a sound that usually comforted her but seemed somehow more insistent than usual. She woke Sunday morning to discover that fog had moved into the mountains during the night. The shelter sat within a gray void, visibility reduced to perhaps 10 or 15 feet in any direction. Sadie checked her watch and saw that she had slept later than intended, already past 7 in the morning. She had planned to start hiking by 6 to ensure she reached her pickup location with time to spare. But the extra sleep had eaten into her buffer. She ate a quick breakfast and packed her gear, deciding to push ahead despite the fog rather than wait for conditions to improve. The forecast had not predicted fog this dense, and she had no way of knowing when or if it would lift. Sadie began hiking south, following the white blazes that marked the Appalachian Trail. In normal conditions, these painted rectangles on trees provided clear guidance, visible from considerable distances and spaced frequently enough that hikers could always see the next blaze before reaching the current one. But in the fog, visibility was so limited that Sadie often could not see the next blaze until she was standing directly beneath the current marker. This forced her to move slowly and carefully, stopping frequently to ensure she had not missed a turn or wandered off the established trail. What should have been a straightforward morning hike became an exercise in navigation and patience. After hiking for approximately an hour, Sadie began to hear voices in the fog ahead of her. The sounds were muffled and indistinct, but they clearly seemed to be human conversation rather than natural forest sounds. She felt a mixture of relief and caution. Other hikers meant companionship and potential assistance if she had navigation questions. But encountering strangers in such limited visibility also carried inherent uncertainty. She called out announcing her presence and asking if anyone was there. Her voice sounded flat and strange in the fog, absorbed almost immediately by the heavy air. She received no response, but the voices continued their muted conversation. Sadie quickened her pace, expecting to catch up with the other hikers within a few minutes. But despite walking steadily forward, she never seemed to get closer to the voices. They maintained their distance ahead of her, always just beyond visibility, sometimes sounding closer and sometimes farther, but never resolving into clear words or distinct speakers. After 30 minutes of following these phantom voices, Sadie stopped and called out again, louder and more insistent. Again, no response. The voices continued their incomprehensible conversation as though she had not spoken at all. Disoriented and increasingly anxious, Sadie pulled out her GPS device to verify her position. The screen displayed information that made no sense. According to the GPS, she was more than 3 miles east of where she should have been, well off the Appalachian Trail in an area of unmarked forest. Sadie stared at the screen in confusion. She had been following the white blazes carefully. She had not deviated from the trail or taken any side paths. The GPS had to be malfunctioning, perhaps struggling to acquire accurate satellite signals through the dense fog and heavy tree cover. She turned off the device and turned it back on, hoping a reset would resolve the problem. When the GPS reacquired its signal, it showed her in the same impossible location, miles from where she believed herself to be. Fear began to creep into Sadie's assessment of her situation. Something was wrong in a way she could not logically explain. She decided to backtrack, retracing her steps to the shelter where she had spent the night and starting over with fresh bearings. She turned around and began hiking in what she believed was the direction she had come from, watching for the white blazes she had been following all morning. But as she walked, she saw no blazes. She saw no trail. She was walking through unmarked forest, the ground beneath her feet covered with leaves, and showing no evidence of the established path she thought she had been following for the past 2 hours. Sadie stopped, forcing herself to breathe slowly and assess the situation rationally. She was lost, though she could not understand how this had happened. The fog had disoriented her more severely than she had realized, and she had somehow wandered off trail without noticing. The voices she had been following were not other hikers, but some acoustic phenomenon created by the fog. Perhaps sounds carrying from a distant location and seeming closer than they actually were. She needed to find the trail again, and the most reliable way to do that was to use her compass and GPS to navigate to a known point. She pulled out her topographic map and attempted to match the terrain around her with the features depicted on paper. Nothing seemed to correspond. The GPS continued to insist she was miles from the trail, which seemed impossible given the limited time she had been walking. Sadie decided to follow a compass bearing directly south, reasoning that this should eventually bring her to a road or trail intersection marked on her map. She began hiking through the forest, no longer following any trail, but instead navigating by compass alone. As Sadie walked, she became aware that the voices had returned. They no longer sounded like they were ahead of her, but rather seemed to come from all around, surrounding her in the fog. Sometimes they sounded very close, as though someone was walking right beside her. When she stopped moving, they stopped as well. When she resumed walking, they started again, maintaining perfect synchronization with her own pace. The realization that the footsteps matched her movements exactly sent a chill through her body that had nothing to do with the November cold. Sadie began to move faster, pushing through the fog with increasing desperation. She checked her compass obsessively, ensuring she maintained her southward heading. Time became difficult to judge in the featureless gray world. She had no visual landmarks, no sense of distance covered, only the mechanical progress of placing one foot in front of the other, while invisible presences moved beside her in perfect rhythm. She found herself fighting panic, reminding herself that panic led to poor decisions, and poor decisions led to disaster in wilderness situations. She walked for what felt like hours, though checking her watch showed only 45 minutes had passed since she decided to abandon the search for the trail and navigate by compass alone. The fog showed no signs of lifting. If anything, it seemed to be growing denser, reducing visibility even further. Sadie began to doubt her compass, wondering if some magnetic anomaly in the rocks beneath her feet was throwing off the readings. But without the compass, she had no way to maintain a consistent direction in the featureless fog. Then, suddenly, she saw a tree she recognized. The distinctive shape of its trunk, a thick oak with a pronounced lean, was unmistakable. She had passed this same tree earlier in her hike. She was certain of it. But that seemed impossible. She had been moving consistently south for the past 45 minutes. She should be far from any landmarks she had seen earlier. Yet, here was the tree, undeniable evidence that she had somehow circled back to a previous location. The fog had turned her around despite her compass navigation. Or the compass itself had failed her, or something in these mountains defied the normal rules of navigation and geography. Sadie felt control slipping away. The calm professionalism she brought to emergency situations at work, failing her in this crisis, where the rules themselves seemed to have changed. She sat down abruptly on the forest floor, forcing herself to stop moving and think clearly. She had food and water. She had warm clothing and emergency supplies. She had a whistle and a way to signal for help. Even if she was truly lost, she could survive until the fog lifted and visibility improved. The rational part of her mind knew this, but another part was screaming that something was deeply wrong, that natural explanations did not account for voices that matched her footsteps or GPS readings that made no sense, or walking in circles despite compass navigation. As she sat there trying to master her rising panic, the fog suddenly lifted. It did not gradually thin or slowly dissipate. It simply vanished, as though someone had switched off a machine generating the gray murk. Sadie found herself sitting in clear November sunlight, surrounded by familiar forest. More importantly, she could see a road less than 100 yards downhill from her position. She stood up shakily and walked toward the road, emerging onto the pavement with overwhelming relief. A Forest Service vehicle appeared around a curve minutes later, and Sadie flagged it down. The ranger driving the truck listened to her story with an expression that suggested he had heard similar accounts before. He radioed dispatch to confirm her identity and arranged for someone to drive her to her parked car. He mentioned that the fog that morning had been unusually dense and that several hikers had reported disorientation and navigation difficulties. He did not seem surprised by her description of hearing voices or walking in circles despite compass bearings. When Sadie described her GPS readings, showing her miles from the trail, the ranger nodded thoughtfully. He said that the area where she had been hiking had something of a reputation, though he was careful not to specify what that reputation entailed. Hikers occasionally reported strange experiences in that section, particularly when fog or other conditions limited visibility. The ranger's matter-of-fact acceptance of her experience suggested this was not the first time he had dealt with similar reports, though he offered no explanations or theories about what might cause such phenomena. Sadie retrieved her car and drove home. Physically exhausted and mentally shaken, she tried to rationalize what had happened, attributing everything to stress, disorientation, and the psychological effects of hiking alone in heavy fog. But deep down, she knew that rational explanations felt insufficient. Something in those mountains had toyed with her, leading her in circles, mimicking her footsteps, showing her impossible locations on her GPS screen. Whether that something was a natural phenomenon science had not yet explained, or something beyond natural law, she could not say. What she knew with certainty was that she would not return to that section of trail, and that her relationship with solo hiking had been fundamentally altered by those hours lost in the fog with invisible companions matching her every step. Gavin Walsh approached his first long-distance hiking attempt with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a passion later in life. At 41 years old, he had spent 2 decades working as a software engineer in Boston, his days consumed by deadlines and screen time. A health scare the previous year had prompted him to reevaluate his priorities, leading him to commit to hiking a significant portion of the Appalachian Trail during his accumulated vacation time. He trained for months, building endurance and testing equipment on weekend trips. He researched obsessively, joining online forums and absorbing advice from experienced thru-hikers. His preparation was thorough and methodical, reflecting the analytical mindset that served him well in his professional life. Gavin began his journey in mid-April, starting from a trailhead in North Carolina with plans to hike northward for 3 weeks. He documented his experience through daily video logs recorded on his phone, intending to compile them into a series for friends and family. The early videos showed a man discovering the joys and challenges of trail life with endearing earnestness. He talked about blisters and pack weight, about the kindness of other hikers, about sunrises viewed from mountain ridges. His enthusiasm was genuine and infectious, and his family members who watched these videos later would remember how happy he seemed during those first days on the trail. The first week progressed without incident. Gavin adapted to the physical demands more quickly than he had expected, his months of training paying dividends. He met other hikers and formed the casual friendships that trail life encouraged, sharing campsites and meals with people whose last names he never learned, but whose trail names became familiar. He experienced the typical challenges of a novice long-distance hiker, but handled them with good humor and determination. His video logs from this period showed a man fully engaged in the experience, someone who had found something meaningful in the simplicity of walking through the wilderness. On day 8, Gavin's demeanor in his evening video log shifted noticeably. He recorded the video from a shelter where he had stopped for the night, and while he maintained his usual cheerfulness, something in his expression suggested unease. He mentioned feeling watched throughout the afternoon, a sensation he attributed to being alone on a particularly remote section of trail. He had encountered no other hikers since morning, and the isolation had begun to feel oppressive rather than peaceful. He also noted finding strange symbols carved into tree bark near his campsite from the previous night. The carvings were fresh, the exposed wood still pale, suggesting they had been made recently. Gavin described them as geometric patterns that did not look like typical trail markers or graffiti, though he could not articulate what made them seem unusual beyond their unfamiliar appearance. His video log from day 9 showed increased concern. Gavin reported that he had found more carved symbols during the day's hike, always near water sources or at trail junctions. The patterns varied but shared certain common elements that suggested they came from the same source. He had photographed several of these carvings, zooming in to capture detail. The symbols appeared deliberately crafted, not random scratches or natural damage to the bark. Gavin also mentioned hearing what sounded like chanting the previous night, voices speaking in unison in a language he could not identify. The sounds had come from somewhere in the forest beyond the shelter, distant but clear enough to be distinctly human rather than animal calls or wind through trees. The video log from day 10, recorded from another shelter, showed a man whose earlier enthusiasm had been replaced by genuine fear. Gavin's voice was tight and his movements nervous as he described finding animal bones arranged in geometric patterns near the water source he had used that morning. The bones were fresh, not weathered or scattered by scavengers, and their arrangement was clearly deliberate. They formed the same kind of patterns he had been seeing carved into trees for the past 2 days. Gavin had photographed the arrangement before disturbing it to fill his water bottles, and the images he captured showed small bones, likely from rodents or birds, laid out with unsettling precision. In this video, Gavin discussed his options. He was 3 days from the nearest road crossing in either direction, and the weather forecast predicted rain that would make hiking more difficult and potentially dangerous. He had enough food and water to continue safely, and logically, he knew that bones and symbols, while disturbing, did not constitute immediate danger. But the cumulative effect of these discoveries, combined with the sensation of being watched and the memory of that chanting, had shaken his confidence. He decided to push through to the next road crossing and reassess from there. He ended the video by noting that the shelter felt exposed despite its solid construction, and that he planned to sleep lightly. Gavin's final video log was recorded that same night. The timestamp showed it was captured around 11 in the evening, several hours after his earlier entry. The video began normally, with Gavin sitting in his sleeping bag and speaking quietly to the camera. He said he had tried to sleep but kept waking to sounds outside the shelter. He mentioned again the feeling of being observed, stronger now than it had been during previous nights. He was trying to convince himself that his imagination was amplifying normal forest sounds into something sinister. Approximately 3 minutes into this final recording, Gavin stopped speaking mid-sentence. His head turned sharply toward the shelter entrance, his expression shifting to one of focused attention. The audio captured what he was hearing, a sound that started softly but grew steadily louder. Multiple voices chanting in unison, the rhythm steady and hypnotic. The language was incomprehensible, but the cadence suggested ritual or ceremony rather than conversation. Gavin whispered that this was the same sound he had heard the previous night, but much closer now, perhaps only 100 yards from the shelter. The chanting continued for approximately 2 minutes, growing progressively louder and seeming to come from multiple directions simultaneously, as though the chanters were surrounding the shelter. Gavin's breathing became rapid and shallow, clearly audible on the recording. He reached for his trekking poles, holding them as improvised weapons while keeping the camera pointed toward the shelter entrance. Then, abruptly, the chanting stopped. Silence filled the recording, broken only by Gavin's ragged breathing and the ambient sounds of nighttime forest. The video went dark suddenly, accompanied by a muffled thud, as though Gavin had dropped his phone. Audio continued to record. There were sounds of rapid movement, Gavin's labored breathing, and what might have been footsteps running through the forest. The breathing grew more desperate, punctuated by small sounds that might have been branches snapping or rocks being displaced. These sounds continued for approximately 45 seconds before falling silent. The recording continued for another 20 minutes, capturing only the typical sounds of a forest at night before the phone's battery finally died. When Gavin failed to check in with his sister as scheduled on day 11, she immediately contacted trail authorities. His last known position was the shelter where he had recorded his final videos. Rangers reached that location and found Gavin's backpack, sleeping bag, and all his equipment exactly where he had left them. His boots sat by the sleeping platform. His water bottles and food bag hung properly in the bear cables. Everything suggested a hiker who had simply stood up and walked away from his gear in the middle of the night, taking nothing with him except possibly his phone. The search that followed was extensive and well organized. Rangers and volunteers combed the area surrounding the shelter, expanding their search radius with each passing day. Bloodhounds tracked Gavin's scent from the shelter into the forest, but lost the trail after approximately a quarter mile, in an area where the terrain became particularly rough and rocky. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the search area. Other hikers who had been in the region during the relevant time frame were interviewed, but none reported seeing Gavin or anything unusual. 3 months after Gavin's disappearance, a section hiker found his phone lying on a rock approximately 10 miles from the shelter, where he was last confirmed to have been. The location was difficult terrain, far from any established trail. The phone was dead but undamaged, and forensic technicians were able to extract the video and audio files it contained. These recordings provided a timeline of Gavin's final days, but no clear explanation of what had happened to him. The images he had captured of carved symbols and arranged bones were enhanced and analyzed. Experts in various fields examined them, looking for connections to known practices or groups. No definitive identifications were made, though several researchers noted similarities to symbols associated with various folk magic traditions. His wallet and identification were found with the phone, carefully placed rather than scattered or dropped. No other trace of Gavin was ever located despite continued searches and appeals for information. The case remains open, and Gavin's family continues to search for answers. The video recordings were not released to the public, remaining in the custody of investigators, but their existence has fueled speculation and theories about what might have happened during Gavin's final hours. Some suggest he experienced a psychological break brought on by isolation and stress. Others point to the evidence of other human presence in the area, as indicated by the carvings and bone arrangements. Still others note that the circumstances resist conventional explanation and may never be fully understood. The shelter where Gavin spent his final night remains in use, though some hikers choose to avoid it after learning its history. Rangers have investigated reports of unusual activity in that area, but have found nothing to suggest ongoing threats to hikers' safety. The carved symbols Gavin documented have not been reported by other hikers, suggesting they were either removed or covered by natural forest growth. The case has become part of Appalachian Trail lore, cited in discussions about solo hiking safety and the mysteries that sometimes occur in remote wilderness areas. Gavin's family established a small memorial at the trailhead where he began his journey, a place where those who knew him can remember the enthusiasm and courage he showed in pursuing this dream, even though it led him into circumstances that remain unexplained and tragic. Lucy and Connor Morrison had been married for 3 years when they decided to celebrate their anniversary with a weekend hiking trip through the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina. Both in their early 30s and living in Columbus, Ohio, they had met at a hiking club 6 years earlier and shared a love of outdoor adventures. They were moderately experienced hikers who had completed numerous weekend trips throughout the Midwest and Appalachian regions, though neither had attempted any extended section hikes. For their anniversary, they planned a romantic 2-day trek through a scenic portion of trail known for its fall foliage and a supposedly spectacular waterfall mentioned in their guidebook. They began their hike on a Friday afternoon in mid-October, parking at a well-marked trailhead and setting off in good spirits. The weather was perfect, with crisp autumn air and clear skies. They maintained a comfortable pace, stopping frequently to photograph the landscape and enjoy the solitude. By late afternoon, they were discussing the waterfall mentioned in their guidebook and decided to look for the side trail that supposedly led to the falls. According to the book, the side trail was marked and relatively easy to follow, adding only an extra mile to their planned route. Around 4 in the afternoon, they spotted what appeared to be a trail junction with a faint path leading off to the right. The main trail continued straight ahead, marked with the familiar white blazes of the Appalachian Trail. The side path bore no obvious markers, but Connor reasoned this was typical for unofficial side trails to scenic features. Lucy expressed some hesitation, noting that the guidebook had not specified exactly where the side trail branched off. But Connor pointed out that they had been hiking approximately the right distance, and that this was the first significant junction they had encountered. They decided to take the unmarked path, planning to turn back if it did not lead to water sounds within 15 minutes. The path wound through increasingly dense forest, descending gradually into a hollow where the trees grew closer together and the light grew dimmer despite the early hour. Lucy and Connor walked for approximately 20 minutes without hearing any indication of a waterfall. They decided to turn back, but when they attempted to retrace their steps, they found themselves unable to locate the junction where they had left the main trail. The path they had been following seemed to have disappeared behind them, leaving only unmarked forest. Connor pulled out their GPS device and was disturbed to see that their location no longer corresponded to any trail shown on their map. They spent the next hour attempting to navigate back to the Appalachian Trail using compass bearings and GPS coordinates. But the technology that should have provided certainty instead offered confusion. Their GPS showed them moving in circles despite their efforts to maintain consistent directions. Their compass readings seemed erratic, swinging between bearings without the magnetic interference that might explain such behavior. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, they acknowledged they were genuinely lost and needed to prioritize finding shelter for the night, rather than continuing to wander through unfamiliar terrain. Connor spotted what appeared to be structures through the trees ahead. As they approached, they discovered an abandoned homestead consisting of several buildings arranged around a small clearing. The structures were old but not ancient, constructed from rough sawn lumber that had weathered to silver gray. The largest building appeared to be a cabin with a covered porch. Smaller outbuildings that might have been storage sheds or animal shelters flanked it. The entire site had an unsettling quality of being frozen in time, as though the occupants had simply walked away one day and never returned. They approached cautiously, calling out to ensure no one was present. The silence that greeted them felt oppressive in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of response. Lucy wanted to continue searching for the trail, even in darkness, but Connor pointed out that hiking at night through unfamiliar terrain was dangerous, and that the homestead offered shelter from the cold that would descend once the sun fully set. They chose the main cabin, testing the porch steps carefully before entering through a door that hung slightly crooked in its frame. The interior consisted of a single large room with evidence of previous habitation. A rusted iron stove sat in one corner. Shelves lined one wall, empty except for a thick layer of dust. A wooden table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. Most disturbing were the windows, which were covered from the inside with what appeared to be old newspapers and cardboard, blocking any view in or out. Connor suggested removing this covering to let in the remaining daylight. But when he tried to pull away the paper, he found it had been secured with dozens of nails driven into the window frame with excessive force. They set up their sleeping bags on the floor farthest from the door, ate a cold dinner from their packs, and tried to settle in for the night. Neither felt comfortable enough to sleep deeply. They took turns keeping watch, though watching for what, neither could articulate. Around midnight, Lucy whispered urgently to Connor, waking him from a light doze. She said she heard movement in the other buildings, doors creaking open and slamming shut, footsteps crossing wooden floors. Connor listened and heard what she described, sounds that suggested human activity in structures that had appeared completely abandoned hours earlier. The sounds continued intermittently throughout the night. Doors opening and closing, footsteps, objects being dragged or moved. Yet whenever the sounds stopped long enough for them to consider investigating, the silence felt even more threatening than the activity. They remained in their chosen building, huddled in their sleeping bags with their headlamps and knives within reach, waiting desperately for dawn. As the first gray light of morning began to filter through gaps in the covered windows, Connor decided he needed to understand what had been making those sounds. He left Lucy in the cabin and quickly checked the other buildings, finding them all empty and showing no signs of recent use. He returned to report this to Lucy, and together they examined the cabin's interior more carefully in the growing light. That was when they found the photographs. Behind the iron stove, partially hidden by rust and shadow, Connor discovered a stack of Polaroid photographs held together with a rubber band. The images showed the homestead from various angles and at different times of day. Some appeared to be documentation of the property, while others seemed more artistic in intent. But the final photographs in the stack showed Lucy and Connor themselves, captured the previous evening as they approached the clearing. One image showed them standing on the cabin porch. Another showed them entering the building. The photographs had been taken from outside, from positions that suggested the photographer had been watching them since their arrival. They fled immediately, not stopping to pack their sleeping bags or organize their belongings. They ran from the homestead in the direction Connor believed was north, based on the sunrise position. Pure panic drove them through the forest, branches scratching their faces and arms, their packs bouncing painfully against their backs. They ran until exhaustion forced them to slow, and then they walked as quickly as the terrain allowed, constantly looking behind them for signs of pursuit. After what felt like hours but their watches showed was approximately 90 minutes, they stumbled onto the Appalachian Trail. The familiar white blazes seemed like salvation. They hiked rapidly north until they reached a road crossing, where they used their cell phone to call for pickup rather than continuing to their planned destination. They told the friend who retrieved them only that they had gotten lost and wanted to go home, not mentioning the homestead or what they had found there. They reported the location to authorities when they returned to Ohio, providing GPS coordinates and a description of the homestead and photographs. Rangers investigated but found the location completely empty. The building stood as Lucy and Connor described, but no photographs were discovered. No evidence suggested recent habitation. The structures were documented as abandoned property on Forest Service land, remnants from an earlier era when people had attempted to scratch out livings in these remote mountains before economic hardship or isolation drove them away. Lucy and Connor never learned who had taken those photographs or why. They never discovered whether someone lived at that homestead permanently or visited it periodically. They never understood how they had become so thoroughly lost, or how they had stumbled upon a location that did not appear on any of their maps. The experience changed their relationship with hiking, replacing the joy they had previously found in wilderness with an awareness that remoteness created vulnerability. They moved to a city apartment shortly after, drawn to the safety of crowds and lights and the constant presence of other people. They no longer celebrate anniversaries with hiking trips, and they have not returned to the Appalachian Trail.